Lina had always believed that family was everything. After losing both parents in a tragic car accident when she was just 16, she and her older brother, Ken, clung to each other like driftwood in a stormy sea. Their childhood home in upstate New York, a modest 2-bedroom farmhouse built in the 1950s, became their entire world. The porch still creaked the same way it did when their mother used to sit there, sipping chamomile tea in the evenings. The scent of old pinewood and lavender soap still lingered faintly in the air. Lina grew into adulthood quietly, avoiding parties, romance, and attention. She worked part-time at the local library and spent most of her evenings curled up with a book and a cup of mint tea. She didn't date, not because she didn't want to, but because love seemed like something reserved for people with less baggage. Ken, on the other hand, was always the ambitious one. He had big dreams, flipping real estate, investing in online startups, chasing the American dream with reckless optimism. But dreams without discipline come at a cost. Unbeknownst to Lina, Ken had fallen deep into debt, 6 figures deep. He had mortgaged the house, drained their inheritance, and taken out loans from people who didn't use contracts, just threats. One gray November afternoon, Lina came home to find Ken pacing in the living room, his face pale, his hair disheveled. She noticed the envelope first, thick, creased, and stained at the corners. Inside were foreclosure notices and demand letters. "I messed up, Lina," he finally admitted, voice trembling. "I thought I could fix it. I thought I could build something for us." Her heart broke not just for the mess, but for the boy she grew up with, the brother who once fixed her scraped knees and stayed up all night when she had the flu. Then came the unthinkable. "There's one way out," Ken said, barely able to meet her eyes. "His name is Damian Rivas. He's interested in you. He's willing to take care of everything, every penny I owe, if you agree to marry him." The words dropped like ice water on her skin. Her brother, her only family, was asking her to give herself away. Not for love, not for choice, but as payment. Lina felt her world tilt on its axis. The betrayal stung sharper than any debt collector's knock. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just sat there, her tea growing cold in her hands, and whispered, "Why me?" Ken couldn't answer. But the deal was already set in motion. And just like that, Lina's quiet, predictable life in that creaky little farmhouse began to unravel, setting the stage for a journey she never imagined, one that would change her forever. Lina sat by the kitchen window, the pale winter sunlight streaking across the old linoleum floor. Outside, snow gathered along the edge of the porch, blanketing the barren maple trees. The air inside the house felt just as frozen, silent, brittle, waiting to crack. Across from her sat Ken, her older brother, his hands wrapped tightly around a chipped ceramic mug that once belonged to their mother. It had "World's Best Mom" printed on it in faded pink letters. That morning, everything felt like a ghost of what it used to be. "He's not a bad man," Ken said, staring into his coffee. "Damian's powerful, wealthy. He can protect you. You'll want for nothing." Lina's chest tightened. The idea of marrying a stranger, no, a businessman who essentially bought her to clear someone else's debt, was something that might have made sense in another century. Not here, not now. And yet, here it was. She felt like a character in one of the old black and white films her dad used to watch on Saturday mornings, where the heroine gave up everything for honor or duty. "How old is he?" she asked softly. "Mid-30s, I think. Maybe 36. He's from Texas originally. Moved to California for business. He owns property all over the country." Lina didn't care about his age, or his fortune, or how many square feet his penthouse might be. What haunted her was the absence of choice. This wasn't love. This wasn't even arranged by tradition or culture. This was desperation, her brother's, and soon, hers. "You're asking me to be payment," she said, her voice no louder than a whisper. Ken looked up then, eyes wet. "No, Lina. I'm asking you to save me." And that was what broke her. Because she remembered the nights he sat beside her hospital bed when she broke her ankle in 9th grade. She remembered how he walked her to school every morning after their parents died, his backpack slung over one shoulder and hers over the other. He had tried. Maybe not wisely, but he had always tried. So, she nodded. It was a quiet, fragile movement, barely perceptible, but enough to send the wheels of her future spinning. Within a week, papers were signed, travel plans arranged, and a bridal gown, satin with antique lace, was flown in from a boutique in Charleston. Everything moved with mechanical efficiency, except Lina's heart, which felt stalled in place. The ceremony was set to take place in a historic chapel in Santa Barbara, overlooking the Pacific. Damien would fly in on his private jet. There would be roses, champagne, photographers. But no friends. No family. Just a girl in a borrowed dress, giving her life away, for the sake of someone she once believed would never let her fall. The chapel overlooked the Pacific Ocean, waves crashing softly against the California cliffs below. The scent of salt air mingled with the sweet perfume of white roses that lined the pews. Lina stood beneath the arched stained glass window, the ocean breeze fluttering the veil pinned into her dark hair. Her dress, though beautiful, felt heavy on her shoulders, too elegant for a girl who used to wear flannel shirts and jeans to church. Across from her, Damien Rivas stood tall, composed, and impossibly polished. In his tailored charcoal gray suit, he looked like a man from another world, a world of luxury cars, marble floors, and boardrooms with million-dollar views. He held her gaze, unwavering, as the officiant recited vows neither of them had written. She said "I do" with a voice barely above a breath. There were no parents to cry, no friends to cheer. Just a few of Damien's business associates seated in the back row, murmuring politely, and a camera crew snapping photos to be filed away, perhaps not in a wedding album, but in a contract file. The reception was just as surreal. A string quartet played under the glow of hanging lanterns, while servers in black bow ties passed out glasses of champagne. Lina barely touched hers. She felt like a guest at her own life. By the time the night ended, she was exhausted, not from dancing, but from holding herself together. The last thing she remembered was Damien leading her toward a sleek black SUV, her heels clicking softly on the stone path. She must have nodded off during the drive because the next thing she knew, she was waking up in an unfamiliar bed. The room was quiet, spacious, and warm. Morning light filtered in through wide plantation shutters, casting pale golden lines across the hardwood floor. She blinked, trying to adjust to the unfamiliar surroundings. The sheets beneath her were impossibly soft, Egyptian cotton, no doubt, and smelled faintly of cedarwood and something else, him. She looked down. Her dress was gone. In its place, she wore one of Damien's crisp white dress shirts, far too large for her but buttoned neatly. Her cheeks flushed. Her gown, folded with care, sat on the tufted bench at the foot of the bed. Just then, she heard a soft knock. The door opened slightly, and Damien stepped in, holding 2 steaming mugs. "Coffee," he offered, his voice steady but not unkind. She nodded slowly, her fingers curling under the sheet. "You fainted last night," he said, handing her the cup. "I think it was the heat. Or the stress. Either way, you're safe now," Lina searched his face for signs of cruelty, of deception, but saw none. Only calm patience. As if he understood how disoriented she felt. "I thought I'd take you to breakfast on the terrace," he added. "Give you a chance to breathe." In that moment, she realized this wasn't her world anymore. It was his. The morning after the wedding, Lina found herself sitting at a wrought iron table on a sun-drenched terrace, high above the Pacific Ocean. The air was crisp, the kind that made you want to pull a knit sweater around your shoulders and breathe deeply. The breakfast spread before her looked like something from a resort catalog: flaky croissants, fresh berries, golden scrambled eggs, and 2 cups of coffee in delicate bone china. It was beautiful. It was quiet. Too quiet. Across from her sat Damien, reading a newspaper printed on thick cream-colored stock. Not a sound, not a smile. Just the occasional flick of a page. Lina sipped her coffee and stared at the ocean. The view was breathtaking, but it only reminded her how far from home she truly was. She thought of her childhood kitchen table back in New York, where the dishes didn't match and the chairs creaked. Somehow, the chipped mug that once belonged to her mother held more comfort than the fine porcelain now in her hand. Damien finally spoke, his voice deep and even. "If there's anything you need, you only have to ask." It was polite. Courteous. But it felt rehearsed, like a line from a script he had used before. "Thank you," she replied, her tone soft. He glanced at her, his gaze lingering a moment longer than expected. "I know this isn't how you imagine your life." Lina swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. What could she say? That she felt like a trophy placed on a shelf? That despite the wealth, the beautiful home, the ocean breeze, she felt lonelier than ever? In the days that followed, Damien showed her a life she had never known. Chauffeured town cars waited at the door. Personal chefs prepared 3-course meals. A walk-in closet appeared overnight, stocked with designer clothing that still bore the tags. They visited art galleries in Beverly Hills, dined at private rooftop clubs in downtown LA, and strolled through vineyards in Napa where wine cost more per bottle than she once earned in a month. But even amid the splendor, Lina felt a distance, one not measured in feet or miles, but in silence. Damien was courteous, attentive even, but carefully guarded. He would brush her arm, open every door, pull out every chair, but never truly reach for her. Sometimes at night, they sat together in the grand living room, fireplace glowing, crystal glasses of wine in hand, and still, it felt like they were worlds apart. Lina wondered if this was what it meant to be cared for without being known. And yet, every so often, Damien's eyes lingered a little longer. His fingers brushed hers when handing her a glass. His voice softened when he said her name. There were cracks in his armor, small, fleeting, but real. And Lina, despite herself, began to wonder what it would feel like if one day, he let her in. It began with small gestures. A coat draped over her shoulders when the ocean breeze turned brisk. A folded note on the breakfast tray, wishing her a gentle day. A playlist left playing softly in the library, songs from the 1970s and 80s, with harmonies that made her feel less like a stranger in her own home. Lina couldn't pinpoint the moment her unease began to shift, but something in Damien had changed. Or perhaps she had changed, softened in places where fear used to live. They spent more time together, not just in the way people coexisted, but intentionally. Damien asked about her childhood, her favorite books, whether she preferred apple pie to cherry. He remembered the answers, too. A week later, a warm apple pie showed up at the dinner table, just the way her mother used to make it, cinnamon heavy with a buttery crust. Still, his presence was complex. Damien was controlled, almost methodical, in how he carried himself. He didn't touch her unnecessarily, but when he did, like the brush of his fingers against her wrist as he handed her a glass of water, her skin remembered for hours afterward. There was restraint in him, but it wasn't cold. It was careful. One evening, after dinner in the sunroom, the rain began to fall. Lina stood at the wide window, watching the droplets race each other down the glass. Damien appeared beside her, holding 2 mugs of cocoa. "You always watch storms?" he asked, his voice gentler than usual. "They make me feel safe," she replied. "Like the world is slowing down just enough to listen." He didn't laugh or tease. Instead, he stood quietly beside her, sipping cocoa as the thunder rolled low in the distance. Over time, the stillness between them changed shape. It became anticipation. Lingering glances, shared silences. Damien's hand would sometimes rest on the small of her back a beat too long. His eyes followed her not with ownership, but with something more curious, almost reverent. One afternoon, they walked the vineyard paths behind the estate. Lina wore a light cotton dress, her hair pinned back loosely. The sun was soft on their shoulders, the wind tugging at the hem of her skirt. Damien reached for her hand, not forcefully, just offering, and she took it. That touch, so simple, sent something fluttering in her chest. Later, in the quiet of the sitting room, he stood close behind her, helping her clasp a silver necklace. His fingers grazed the nape of her neck, and she shivered, not from cold, but from the weight of the moment. "You don't have to fear me, Lina," he murmured, his voice low and firm. "I don't," she whispered back, and she realized it was true. The game between them wasn't about power anymore. It had become something far more delicate, a dance of minds, of longing, and of 2 guarded hearts slowly unfolding toward each other. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind where time drifts gently and everything feels still. Lina had wandered into the library, a room she had come to love for its worn leather chairs and tall oak shelves that smelled faintly of dust and old paper. Damien had told her to make the house her own, and she often did, curling up with books, rearranging flowers in glass vases, even placing framed photos on side tables to make it feel less like a museum and more like a home. One photo frame sat face down on a desk in the corner. It had been that way since the day she arrived. Curiosity, that quiet spark that lives in all of us, finally nudged her hand forward. She lifted the frame and brushed her fingers across the glass. It was a photograph, faded but intact, of a younger Damien, maybe in his late 20s, standing beside another man in a dark suit. But what drew her eyes wasn't the man. It was the girl in the background. Herself. She was younger, maybe 19, sitting on a bench in Central Park. She remembered the day, autumn leaves, a college trip to New York City, a borrowed red scarf around her neck. She hadn't known anyone was taking pictures. Her hands began to tremble. That moment, that photo, years before they ever met. Footsteps behind her. Damien's voice, quiet but unmistakably present. "I wondered when you'd find that." She turned to him slowly, the frame still in her hands. "You knew me, back then?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw you once," he replied. "That day. I was in the city for business. I remember thinking, you look so at peace. Like the world hadn't touched you yet." Lina stared at him, her thoughts racing. "And you kept the photo?" "I didn't even know your name at the time," he said, stepping closer. "I didn't plan any of this, not at first. But when Ken came to me, desperate and in debt, and he showed me your photo, said you were his sister, I recognized you. And something in me. I couldn't walk away. It was too much. Too close. Too coincidental. So this wasn't just a business deal, she said, blinking back the sting in her eyes. You'd been watching. Waiting. No, Damien said gently. Not watching. Just remembering. I never forgot you, Lina. And when fate brought you back into my life, I couldn't ignore it. She looked away, the trust they had been building now cracking like ice underfoot. Was it fate? Or was it possession dressed in charm? You should have told me, she whispered. From the beginning. I know, he said quietly. I was afraid it would scare you away. And the truth is, I wasn't ready to admit how much you already meant to me. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of uncertainty, of longing, and of the question that hung between them like the weight of a memory. Was this love, or something he had always meant to claim? The house felt quieter after the truth came out. Not in a physical sense, there was still the hum of the refrigerator, the faint classical music that played softly through ceiling speakers, the sound of seagulls calling from the cliffs, but in Lina's heart, everything had shifted. What once felt like a slow unraveling into comfort now felt like standing at the edge of something uncertain. She spent most of her days walking the coastal path behind the estate. The ocean stretched endlessly to the west, its deep blue waves crashing against the rocks below. Lina used to find peace in the rhythm of the tide, but now each crash sounded like a question she couldn't answer. She had learned the truth. Damien had known who she was before they ever met. He had orchestrated the marriage not purely out of debt forgiveness or business interest, but because he had seen her once, years ago, and never let the memory go. It wasn't just a coincidence, it was a decision, carefully made. The idea of being chosen should have been flattering. But for Lina, it raised deeper questions. Did he love her, or the version of her he had imagined from afar? One afternoon, she sat with Damien on the terrace overlooking the ocean. The wind was gentle, the sunlight catching in his dark hair. He handed her a cup of coffee, black, the way she liked it, and for a long time, they said nothing. Finally, she broke the silence. Why didn't you ever give me a choice? He looked at her, his face unreadable, then nodded slowly. You're right, he said. I didn't. I thought, if I could build a life so beautiful, so safe, you'd never want to leave it. But that was fear talking, not love. His honesty startled her. Not defensive. Not calculated. Just bare. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside was a key. A simple house key, hers. The deed to the beach cottage is in your name now, he said quietly. It's 10 miles up the coast. No staff. No security. No expectations. If you choose to go, I'll respect it. No questions. No pressure. Lina stared at the key, her fingers trembling as she took it. And if I stay, she asked, her voice low. Then you stay because you want to, Damien said. Not because you were promised safety. Or luxury. Or a life wrapped in silk. Just me. All of me. That night, Lina stood in the doorway of the cottage. The air smelled of pine and salt. The place was quiet, simple, a wooden porch, a small fireplace, a worn rocking chair that creaked just slightly in the wind. She stayed until sunrise. And then, without a suitcase, without a single word, she returned to Damien, walking back not because she had to, but because her heart finally chose him. The morning she returned to him was cool and quiet. A low fog rolled in from the sea, softening the horizon, blurring the line between water and sky. Lina's steps were slow but certain as she climbed the winding path back to the estate. No chauffeur. No entourage. Just the sound of her own heartbeat and the crunch of gravel beneath her sneakers. Damien was on the terrace, exactly where she'd left him the morning before. He didn't look surprised when she appeared at the edge of the stone balustrade. He simply stood, his eyes meeting hers, waiting, not with expectation, but hope. "I thought I needed to be alone to think," she said, her voice steady. "But the truth is, I just needed to know if I could walk away." Damien nodded, silent. "I could," she continued. "The door was open. The cottage was peaceful. No one would have stopped me. And yet you're here," he said quietly. Lina stepped closer, reaching for his hand. It was warm, familiar now, and when his fingers wrapped around hers, it no longer felt like possession. It felt like home. "I'm here," she said, "because I want to be. Not because I owe you. Not because you rescued me. But because somewhere between your silences and your glances, your restraint and your longing, I found a life I didn't know I needed." The days that followed were not filled with grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Instead, they were quiet and honest. They planted herbs in clay pots for the kitchen windowsill. They read together on rainy afternoons, sharing passages aloud from books they both loved. Lina taught Damien how to make grilled cheese sandwiches with real butter and thick sliced bread, the right way, she called it, and he surprised her by loving it. There were still moments of tension, of course. No life, no love, is without its edges. But the difference now was in the way they moved through it, not as strangers forced together by circumstance, but as partners who had chosen each other. On their 1-month anniversary, Damien brought her a small wooden box. Inside was the original photo from Central Park, the one Lina had found in the library. But now it was joined by another, the two of them on the vineyard path, hand in hand, laughing in sunlight. "I used to think I fell in love with the memory of you," Damien said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "But now I know, I love this you. The real one. The one who walked away, and came back." Lina smiled, her heart full. In a world that had once felt like a gilded cage, she had found something rare, a love not owed, not arranged, not bought, but chosen. And for the first time in her life, that choice was hers alone. As we grow older, we begin to see that life is not always about the grand events, but the quiet moments of choice that shape our path. The story of Lina and Damien, though fictional, offers several timeless truths that speak to the heart, especially for those who've lived long enough to understand the weight of trust, forgiveness, and the power of choosing love over fear. At its core, this is a story about agency, the freedom to choose. Lina began her journey in a place of powerlessness, where her life was dictated by the decisions of others. Many of us, at some point in life, have felt that same loss of control, caring for aging parents, sacrificing dreams for family, or waking up to find the road we're on is not the one we planned. And yet, as Lina discovered, it is never too late to reclaim our voice. Her decision to return to Damien wasn't about surrender, it was about stepping into her strength, on her own terms. Another vital lesson here is the idea that love cannot be built on ownership. Damien may have offered Lina comfort, luxury, and even safety, but it wasn't until he let her go, truly gave her the option to walk away, that love had the chance to grow. There's a quiet wisdom in that. Real love doesn't trap or pressure. It doesn't demand loyalty in exchange for favors. It stands still and says, "Choose me, if you want to." In long marriages, friendships, and family ties, we sometimes forget that the most meaningful bonds are not those maintained out of obligation, but those renewed by conscious choice. This is especially important for older adults, many of whom are navigating retirement, widowhood, changing family dynamics, or even reimagining love later in life. The idea that we still have the right to choose joy, companionship, and connection freely is a powerful reminder that our story isn't over. Lastly, Lina's journey teaches us the value of seeing people for who they are now, not just who they were or what they were supposed to be. Damien had to let go of the memory he clung to and learn to love the real Lina, the complex, growing, independent woman she had become. Many of us are still learning this, even in our 60s, 70s, or beyond. People change. So do we. And grace, whether in marriage, friendship, or with our children, means accepting that growth. So what can we take from this story? Perhaps it's that second chances are real, but they require honesty. That freedom and love can walk side by side. And that, no matter our age, the most beautiful decision we can make is to love someone not because we must, but because we truly want to.